And we are live. This is John Wilkson for the Councl Google Plus. The Council is now in session. Here tonight, we have a special guest tonight with Jason Mullett from Logical Belief Ministries. Matt Slick just joined in.
There you go.
Hey, how you doing there, Matt?
Good, all right.
We are just starting right now. We're going to briefly talk to Jason Mullett first.
Sure.
And then, he had a conversation with Dr. Leighton Flowers earlier today concerning free will. So I'm going to go ahead and let him take over and just kind of give us some thoughts about it and kind of plug his show that we're going to probably have later on. And we'll go ahead and let him take the wheel. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, John. You can, anybody else listening, on the same network as the Councl Google Plus. So, am I on, by the way? I'm not seeing myself pop up when I'm talking. Can you guys hear me?
You're just fine.
Okay. So earlier today, I did have a dialogue with Leighton Flowers, particularly on the topic of libertarian free will. And, so I'll kind of just jump into that particular conversation and where I think that some of the issues are with Leighton's position, and maybe get some feedback from the rest of you guys. I can only be here for about 20 minutes. I got to get going, but I'll give a few of my thoughts on how it went. I think that ultimately Leighton's position, and really anybody from a Southern Baptist or the traditional position, and I put air quotes around that, that holds to a form of synergism, is going to have a really difficult time in affirming both their definition of free will and at the same time support their denomination's position on original sin. I think that is where, and this is one of the areas that I press Leighton on, and I would like for those of you that listen to it to see how you think that particular part of the conversation went, and that was fairly early on where I pressed him on that. But Leighton's definition of free will or libertarian free will, and I'll actually read you his definition, and I'll let you guys kind of know what I think are the difficulties with it, and then get your feedback on it. But his definition of contracausal freedom is the ability of the will to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action, the selection between two available options. So that is what Leighton says he affirms. He says that man has that capacity and that ability to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action. Well, the issue that I would have with that is I don't know how he can affirm any doctrine of original sin at the same time that he affirms that definition of libertarian free will. Because if man is born with any inclination at all towards sin, and his will is inclined in that way in any capacity, and because of that inclination, he by necessity then commits sin, then how does the will have the ability to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action? How is it indifferent when presented with two moral choices between that which is pleasing to God and that which is not pleasing to God, is usually the categories I like to give, because I think that is what the Bible defines as what is good and what is evil, is that which is pleasing to God and that which is not pleasing to God. And so if man's will is inclined in any degree at all towards sin, and man in himself, any particular man who is born did not make the choice to have this particular inclination towards sin. And man is, and this is another area that I pressed Leighton on, because you guys are all well aware of how he uses the term responsible, and he he changes that into response-able, and then and when I pressed him on this area, he didn't really flesh it out. But ultimately, his presupposition behind that is that God cannot hold men responsible unless they are able. So my question for Leighton, since he does affirm original sin and that man has an inclination towards sin, and he affirmed both of those statements, is that if man did not choose this propensity or this inclination towards sin, and he by necessity commits sin because of this inclination, then how is he responsible, in the sense that Leighton says that man has to be responsible if he is able? The other question I had for him is, if his definition of free will is true, then he is actually affirming that man has the capacity to obey God's law perfectly. Because if he has the ability to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action, he has that capacity and that ability, then it logically follows that he has the capacity and the ability to perfectly fulfill God's law. And Leighton follows that with saying that, and this is from one of his podcasts, he actually said this. He said that we are unable to fulfill the demands of the law. We are not able to earn our own righteousness through good works.
What?
I don't know how he can affirm both at the same time. How can he affirm that man has the ability to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action, but at the same time say we are unable to fulfill the demands of the law? And I think that is ultimately where his position collapses in that particular area. I don't know what your thoughts are. Maybe Matt, you can jump in and give me your thoughts.
I think you give a really good analysis on it. You really got in there. I'm curious now, in light of what you said with him, what his view of prevenient grace would be, if he has a Wesleyan or pure Molinist or what, because that would be interesting to see. Because from what you're saying, if the person naturally has the ability to keep that law, then he doesn't need prevenient grace. I'd be interested to see how that might flow with him as well.
He denies prevenient grace.
Oh, he does? Okay, well, that's more consistent then.
Yeah.
Maybe he, okay, that's interesting that you say he denies it, because I didn't ask him specifically the question on prevenient grace, but some of the answers that he gave me are basically prevenient grace. For example, when we were working on exegeting Romans chapter 8, and I pressed him on, how he says, for the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Ultimately, his response to that, well, man has the ability to choose to not have his mind set upon the flesh because God gives him the grace so that he can do that. So he can ultimately make that choice to come out of it.
That's prevenient grace. That's another form of it.
Exactly. And so when you say that he denies prevenient grace, I find that kind of interesting, because that was an affirmation for me that he does believe in prevenient grace. Where I think that his position then collapsed is I pressed him on that. And I said, does this grace that you're talking about that God gives man that enables him to no longer be in the flesh, does that result in him putting his faith and trust in Christ? And he says, well, no, that just gives man the ability to choose whether to have his faith and trust in Christ. And so this is where I explained to him this. I said, well, ultimately, Leighton, I think what you're saying is that man is actually, God saves men based upon the fact that God sees, he observes, that they of their own free will, not efficaciously as a result of his grace, but they of their own free will, because God's grace does not determine whether they will believe or not believe. So therefore, it's left to man's free will. And so that makes faith by itself a work of man, and does not make it the result of God's grace. John 6:29 is one thing I brought up. It's a work of God that you believe. And so I think this is where it divides us, because Leighton holds that faith is the working out that man does by himself, which is not efficaciously caused by God's grace. He accomplishes it by his own free will. So therefore, faith becomes a work that man does in and of himself. And the Reformed view is instead that our faith is because of the working of the Spirit in our life and bringing us to regeneration and new life. And as a result of that, we demonstrate and we act upon and we have faith. But the ultimate cause of it is God's work in our life. And so faith does not become solely the work of man, and therefore and this is where I press Leighton on, is I said, ultimately your position is that we are saved by a work that we accomplish on our own. And this is where he didn't like the distinction I made between faith that is the result of God's efficacious work versus faith that is a result of free will. I think one is a work. I think another one is not. The other one is not. I think the Reformed view of faith as a result of regeneration, the work of grace, is not a work. When Paul says that we are not saved by works, but we are saved by grace through faith, Paul's argument is not that it is a faith generated from the will of man, but is a faith resultant of the grace of God.
Amen.
Well, and I think that's the difference.
And Paul says right afterwards, it is by grace through faith.
Through faith. Yeah.
So it is a work of God so that no one can boast.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. And if you, I'm going to plug something real quick. If you've got little kids, the Slugs and Bugs Sing the Bible, Volume 2, track 5, I think, has that verse to music, and it's beautiful. So my kids and I have been singing that around the house. So, but yeah, I mean, it is a work of, Paul tells us it's a work of God, so that we can't boast. I mean, if there's any part that we add to our salvation, we can boast in it.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think you've analyzed Leighton well.
It just blows my mind, and I agree with Matt that
let me ask you guys,
Jason, you've done a good job. I look forward to watching this. I didn't get a chance to this afternoon.
Let me ask you guys this question. Ultimately, I think Leighton's definition of free will is full Pelagianism.
Yep.
But
I was going to say at least semi-Pelagianism, but yeah, it's definitely Pelagian to some extent.
I think he's inconsistent with him then trying to affirm original sin. That is his semi-Pelagianism coming in. But his definition of free will is full Pelagian.
Chris may have a different take on this, but in listening to him, he kind of shifts back and forth between a compatibilism and then a semi-Pelagianism. It's like he wants to straddle the fence between the two.
Well, but then the other night when we had that long discussion, and I kind of pinned him down on this exact topic, and he admitted that and here's how he would say it. He would say that man, of course, is given general revelation in nature, and depending on how you react, how you respond to that revelation, God gives you further revelation.
Yeah.
So I asked him about that when he posited that. I said, well, does that mean that the reason that you receive special revelation in order to bring you to salvation, because that's the view you would take, that the gospel, the special revelation of the gospel would be the grace that God uses. But the reason that you would even receive that and have that opportunity is based on how you deal with the revelation you were given before. So, and he quite readily admitted that was the fact. And he said that's what the Bible says. That, so that basically, I don't understand how he doesn't get off that. Then salvation is completely and totally up to man.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting that you brought that up, because that was something we were talking about before the show. But that is something that he said that I had never.
I have to call and be right back.
What you just said there. I'm sorry, what was your name, Chris?
Yeah.
What you just said there, Chris, was something that he said in our dialogue probably about halfway through that actually kind of floored me. I haven't listened enough to Leighton. I haven't actually listened to him very much at all. I've heard him in a few debates, and I heard him in a couple dialogues, and I tried to listen through one of his podcasts before our debate. Oh man, it's painful. But I was actually completely floored by his response where he said that. I was not actually expecting him to say that. he actually said this, and this is really what you brought up. He actually said that God does not judge man for any sin except for the sin of unbelief, the sin of rejecting his provision of salvation.
Right.
That's the only sin that God judges man for. And ultimately, where I then pressed him was that means that you're then saying, Leighton, if you're saying that those who never heard the gospel go to hell, then they must in some capacity have been availed of the gospel in such a way that they could reject it. And his response to that was, well, God gives light to everyone, and when you respond to the light that you're given, he gives you more light. And so to me, it seems to be that he is affirming and so I took him to Romans 10, where Paul says, well, how can they know unless somebody preaches to them? And to me, he seems to be affirming that man, outside of the proclamation of the gospel through the agency of Christians, have the ability to come to the gospel. And I don't know. That's completely an unbiblical category. I don't. The first problem I have is that God only judges men for unbelief. I find that to be rather astounding.
Right, Jason, you and I were talking about that before the show started. And I pointed out that when people say that, because I've heard that position before. I grew up Church of Christ. I've heard it from independent fundamentalist Baptists that Jesus atoned for the sins of all the world, but then people go to hell for unbelief. And then you press them on it, and it's like, okay, so he atoned for all the sins except for unbelief. so he atoned for almost all sins.
Yeah.
And then when he said it is finished on the cross, he probably should have said it is almost finished, or it's pretty much finished. Yeah.
And what I mentioned before the show, I'll bring this up too for the recording. But John Owen, in his book *The Death of Death*, I think in chapter 4 somewhere, says that there's really only three options: either Christ died for all of the sins of all people, or he died for all of the sins of some people, or he died for some of the sins of all people. Those are the three options that you have. Well, most will outright reject, well, some of the sins of all people doesn't make sense. So they'll say, well, it's all of the sins of all people. Well, then why are some people not saved? Well, it's because they don't believe. Well, then just what you said, is not unbelief a sin that Christ died for? And then they have to result in, well, Christ's death was for some of the sins of all people. And ultimately, that's where they have to end up at. Which I don't think is substantiated in Scripture at all. By one sacrifice, he perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. The work of Christ was perfect. It actually accomplished the salvation of those being sanctified.
Amen.
It did not partially make their salvation available. It was finished, tetelestai at the cross. But it just comes back to not only that problem, but the issue that there are people who have never heard the gospel, who have never had it preached to them, but yet Leighton's position is that outside of that proclamation of the gospel, people can be saved due to the light of revelation, general revelation. I just, that is something, I'm gonna really think about, because that was the first I was presented with that from Leighton. But I'm gonna really, and maybe some of you guys can help me flesh this out, but I'm gonna really work on addressing that, because I think that is that's a huge non-biblical category right there. And I think Paul really refutes it in Romans 10.
Right. I mean, the other aspect of that is that if you hold to that position, that unbelief is the only sin. Well, So you go again. If you go to the person in the Amazon or the person in the middle of nowhere, and they're never brought the gospel. How is it their fault that they never heard the gospel? Whose fault is it, and who are we laying blame on?
Well, and I think Leighton's response to that would be is that they have special revelation, or not special revelation, they have general revelation, which if they would humbly submit themselves to of their own free will, God would give them and provide them more revelation, which would ultimately result in their salvation. I mean, that was the response that I got from him right there. That's his response to that.
Yeah.
And I find Romans 1 to say the complete opposite, that general revelation results in condemnation, but it does not result in salvation. There's no salvation possible through general revelation. I mean, Paul says in Romans chapter 10, he says, how then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are feet those who preach good news. So what Leighton is in fact saying is, no, Paul, you're actually not right. They can call on him in whom they have not believed, and they can believe in him in whom they have not heard, and they can hear without somebody preaching. That has to be Leighton's position.
Well, I would imagine, to be fair, I would imagine his position is that through general revelation, it would soften their hearts, and then God would send somebody to preach to them. That's what I would imagine would be a fair representation. I'm not saying that you're being unfair, but
yeah.
But I mean, like we can take it to the absurd conclusion. I try to.
So if man,
but I agree with you that it's inconsistent. It's just,
yeah, but if man has this, and this is where if man has this ability that Leighton says that he does, he has this ability. Right. Let me read his definition of free will again. If he has the ability to refrain or not refrain from any given moral action, then would it not then be true that despite the fact that there have been literally centuries of millions, possibly billions of people passing on in absolute ignorance of the gospel, and that Christ has procured and died for their salvation, died for all of their sins, like I guess except for unbelief. If that's true, then why did none of them exercise that free will and be able to provide for themselves that avenue of getting the gospel to them? But yet there are centuries of people, let's say in North America, who long before the first missionary ever reached them, died, and never heard the gospel. Why did none of them ever exercise this free will? And as a result, be given the gospel, somebody would be sent to them. Maybe I don't know. I'm just not sure how that would work.
Right. Well, I'm looking forward to listening to your interaction with Leighton.
Yeah, I expect him talking about 70% of the time and me about 30%. So.
Yeah, that's normal.
I just didn't want him. He generally makes the accusation. I've heard him several times. Well, nobody lets him talk. They always cut him off. I had to cut him off several times because it just got too long-winded. But I generally tried to let him speak as long as he needed to. But all right. Anybody here that actually listened to the dialogue at all, or is nobody here actually listened to it?
I haven't heard it yet, Jason.
Okay.
And I tried, but I fell asleep when Leighton was talking. No, I kid you not. And I'm not saying it to be funny. Like, I literally, because his voice, the way he talks, he has that
Well, because you're not trying to be funny, that's what makes it funny.
Yeah, I'm just being honest. Like, I heard it, and because it's so common to me, because he sounds the same in everything he does, I literally was falling asleep. And this is bad because I just taken pre-workout, so that should tell you how that works. And I'm not kidding about that either. That's a real thing.
Does Leighton jump in here with you guys quite often
Right
on the council?
Occasionally. I mean, once every few months.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's really. I'll turn it back over. I don't really have anything else. I mean, that's pretty well how I would summarize the dialogue. We did go into some text towards the end, like 2 Peter 3:9 and 1 Timothy 2:4, which I thought was beneficial. But I don't. It was just. It's one thing I think with Leighton. I think you almost have to have a formal debate, and you got to hold it to time. That way, you can actually stick to the topic, or else you're going to end up venturing off into all kinds of weird areas that are not supposed to be the topic of discussion. But so, all right, I'll turn it over to whoever's hosting the show.
Oh, cool. I've been told that you John lost audio, so I've been told that you need to head out.
Yeah, I'm going to head out here and just.
Alrighty. Well, thanks for coming on. Again, like I said, I look forward to listening to it, and I'll probably hit you up on Google Plus, and maybe we'll have you on another time as well.
All right.
I listened to it.
Oh,
you listened to it?
I did.
So what are your thoughts on it?
So it's always with his definition of free will that kind of gets me off course, because I don't necessarily disagree with it, because I think it's so ambiguous that it doesn't clarify anything. That's why when libertarians use it, I'm just kind of uninterested with their view entirely, because a determinist can use the same definition, but it means absolutely something different to them than it does for a libertarian. Because in any given state of circumstances, I could do contrary to what I do. That's because can and ability and words like that are ambiguous. They don't tell me about why I do an action. So what Leighton's just doing is sort of presenting this weird, put you in circumstances you could do. Under certain circumstances, I could do contrary. But that doesn't answer what I will do or why I do what I do. That's just uninteresting.
Yeah, that's ultimately the issue. The question is why? What determines your choices? And ultimately, Leighton doesn't like to answer that particular question. He didn't do the objection he normally does, which I expected him to, which I've heard him do several times. He usually says that if you ask what determines a particular choice, he says, well, that question begs the question because you're assuming a deterministic answer is required.
I wish he would have said that. That would have been great, because that means he believes the will is completely uncaused.
Exactly. That means it's a self-caused. You have an effect without an actual cause. It's a self-causing effect that the will determines.
But you would have at least put him somewhere. His one definition doesn't put him anywhere. He doesn't even put his feet on the ground. It just says, well, you can possibly do this or you can possibly not do this. Well, that's interesting. So what? And anyway, I forgot to add that. You can possibly do any moral given action, or you can possibly not do any given moral action. Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't really. It really needs to be is what. And this I did have the question in my opening statement where I broke it out a little bit, but I didn't press him on that. And that would have been a good thing to do, is to really actually press him on what actually determines a particular choice, and he has to either say, and this is where I just don't think the libertarian view of free will is really even coherent, because they ultimately either have to say, and I'd like to get your view on this, Vincent, but they either have to say that the will determines its own choices. But what is will? The will is the power of choosing. So that means that the power of choosing determines choices. So a choice determines a choice. So is a prior choice required in order for there to be a choice? And if that's true, then the prior choice also requires a choice. And now you've got an infinite regress, and you ultimately end up never making a choice. Or, as Edwards said, ultimately you go back, and at some point you have a beginning, right? You were born. So what determined your first choice? And if your first choice was not determined by the will, and it was something outside of the will that determined the first choice, then all the resulting choices are not free in the libertarian sense. And ultimately, I think the libertarian view denies even the law of cause and effect, that you have an effect that is its own cause. It just doesn't really make any sense when you really start looking into it. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I actually asked him that question before. I've talked to him, and I did not get a great response. And the rest of he called me an atheist philosopher. I don't know which one anymore. Oh, Sam Harris. He called me Sam Harris.
Oh, okay.
So that's it. I mean, that was fun, but
that's an effective argument.
Yeah, it didn't work out in his favor after, but it was unique. I never had that one before. So, yeah, I completely agree. I don't even give credence to the libertarian perspective because I think it's incoherent.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to it's in the Bible. No, it's not.
Well, and he did make, and I just didn't have time to address it. He did make an argument at the end when I told him that our choices are determined by the greatest motivation, inclination at the moment of choice, and what motivates us and inclines us towards particular choices is our nature, and then also the environment and the things that are presented to us. And then his response to that was, well, that's just animal instinct. All you're saying is we're just an animal. Well, and I wanted to address something else, so I didn't even address that. But my response to that is we are moral agents. We actually have knowledge inherently and intrinsically given to us by our Creator, that the choices that we do make, even though they may be in accordance with our nature and determined by what motivates our greatest motivation at the moment of choice, we know and we have knowledge that those moral choices that we are making are inherently opposed to the revealed will of God. And that is not an animal instinct. That is a moral agent making a choice that they know is wrong, contrary to the revealed will of his Creator.
And that's where he kind of...
Animal instinct sounds so evolutionary, you know what if that's what I mean, where does that come from, apart from God? You know, even if you want to claim that, they're just he just sounds like he's trying to put it off to something that's unrelated to God, as long as it's not related to God.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, I mean, even animal instinct in itself is not independent of God.
But at best, all you could say, yeah, animals make choices. It doesn't even help his position. Just, they make choices. That doesn't do him any good. You may say, well, that's a little absurd. You can accept that. I'm not going to. Well, that's your problem. That doesn't disprove my case. Can you try better than that?
Stop being an atheist, Watson.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I mean, clearly there's a difference between we don't just mindlessly do actions sort of like animals, but the complexity of our choices are very different.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
My choice to participate in a building project of some kind is much more different than like a dog eating cat feces. The complexity of one choice is much different from the other. I don't get, that's not a clever point for him.
Yeah. What comes down to what causes us to give us our greatest motivation at the moment of choice is due to a very complex series of both our intellect being employed, what we know about the situation, by the environment presented to us at that moment, by our nature. All of these come into play when we actually make a choice. And our choices are moral because we have a revelation from God telling us what is in accordance to his character and what is not.
His view. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and whether we make that choice according to our nature or not doesn't mean that it's not contrary to God's revealed will. And we know it. So therefore, we are culpable for it. And God can either give us the efficacious grace, because he is not by necessity required to give any particular moral agent who's a rebel by nature against him. He's not necessitated by any obligation to give them grace. But God does. That's the amazing thing. The amazing thing is that God actually gives us grace. And that he not only saves us, but he enables us to do those things which are ultimately pleasing in his sight. And I think because of the merit of Christ, this is one thing Calvin said in his Institutes, so I'm not going to remember exactly where, but Calvin said this, is that while we as Christians, we now have the capacity and the ability that our choices and the things that we do are pleasing to God, but ultimately they're still tainted by sin. So because of the merits of Christ, God chooses to be pleased with our imperfect works for him. God chooses to be pleased with them. Because even if he's not, we have the righteousness of Christ imputed to us. Exactly. That's the point. And so even as a Christian, our righteousness is still an alien imputed righteousness given to us.
Right.
I forgot his response. You asked a question that always arises in my mind. So he finds hardening an issue with on Calvinism. But you pointed out, from my recollection, that the same problem arises on his own view, which, what is the point of hardening people that can always just do contrary? If it just absolutely does nothing, then it's a fruitless thing to do, because they could just choose the right thing, right? To where he seems to tie that in with the issue of those who have not heard the word, even though I don't get how that necessarily corresponded to the example was the Jews, who would have been familiar with the Old Testament and would have had plenty of revelation. So I don't know how they're lacking this revelation. It seems like he wants to completely take out one of the problem. He wants to reduce the problem to just merely an epistemological problem and reduce the spiritual problem.
Well, I think he conflates the epistemological problem with the spiritual problem. I think he makes them one and the same. And maybe we're not talking about the same thing, but you're talking about where he conflates total depravity with judicial hardening. And he says, with us Calvinists, it's just a distinction without a difference. Why would God harden somebody's heart who's already hard? Well, the point is the Jews had knowledge of the Old Testament. They knew the Messiah. They knew the prophecies of the Messiah. And the judicial hardening and the hiding of the identity of the Messiah, where Jesus told people to not reveal who he was and all this, was due to the point is that they had revelation about who the Messiah is, and it was God's desire for the resulting crucifixion of the Son of God. And if men would have, because of the revelation given to them and seen that Jesus matched up to the revelation, would have made the choice even in their depraved nature, to not desire to crucify the Son of God, because but not because of a humble submission to the righteousness of God and in a salvific way. The purpose of it was a hardening to bring about the crucifixion of Christ and to prevent them from recognizing him as the Messiah. But there's plenty of Jews even today that recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, but that doesn't make them Christians. And I think that he doesn't see the distinction that we make, where we say total inability and total depravity is in relation to man submitting himself to the gospel, submitting himself to the righteousness of God, and not that man doesn't have the ability to make an external act of obedience to the law of God. I mean, an example of it would be is the Jews had repeatedly rebelled against God and his revelation. God repeatedly took them in, judged them with the nations around them. Ultimately, he takes them into the Babylonian captivity. And as a result of this, of all this judgment of God, he basically cured them of outright apostatization to foreign gods. For 400 years, while Judaism, by the time of Christ came along, was a dead religion, it was a superficial religion. They were no longer bowing to idols anymore. There was no Baals and Ashtoreths in Israel during the time of Christ. And so I don't understand why Leighton doesn't see the distinction we make when we say there is a distinction between judicial hardening and the inability of man to, come in faith to Christ. Is that what you were referring to, or?
No, it was more of tied in with the way you respond to general revelation will decide whether you receive more revelation, to where it seems to be not rather an issue of their spiritual states of people, but rather it seems to be an epistemological problem where, well, they just don't know the gospel. There's nothing spiritually, there's this, they don't have some, what did he keep on saying? Some inborn something from Adam.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying. So you're saying that from his position, it's just a knowledge issue for them and not an inherent corruption of nature for them. It's just a knowledge issue. I heard him say this because I listened to one podcast in preparation for this debate, and he said he said this, and I actually wrote it down. Let me find it. I was actually, and it goes right along with what you're saying, is when he was addressing when he says, well, Calvinists say that man is not able to come to the gospel. And he goes, well, of course, they can't come to the gospel if they don't hear the gospel. Well, they're not able to come and respond to that which they haven't heard. Well,
I remember hearing that.
That is such a conflation. That is not what we're talking about. That is the biggest red herring I've ever heard. He did say that on the podcast. He didn't say this on my dialogue with him, but I have heard him say that.
Yeah, I think I know it was a recent one, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was it was, I just went to his YouTube page, just typed free will, and it was his most recent one on the topic. And he said that, and I'm like, that's a classic example of a red herring that's completely unrelated to even what we're saying.
Okay, with that, I want to go ahead and close this topic down. Again, thank you so much, Jason, for sharing all that, and I really do appreciate the time that you took with Leighton Flowers, and I hope that I'm looking forward to hearing the whole thing. I only heard like the last 20 minutes of it, so it'll probably get released here sometime soon on the podcast form. You can watch the video if you wanted to on Bible Thump and Wingnut, I believe. So,
all right, we'll talk to you guys later.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you coming in.
Good having you, man.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah,
right.
You're the best, man. Okay, with that, I don't think Matt is here at the moment. He said he stepped out to go get some dinner. So, does anyone else have something else to bring up? What was that?
Didn't Leighton want to come in? Oh.
Nikki T showed up again. Yeah, no kidding. Hey, Nikki. Did you have a question for any of us?
I always have lots of questions.
You were the one that gave us that question last week, right?
Yes.
Great question, by the way.
Are we sure this isn't Alex?
Excuse me.
It's funnier to us who know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Well, without the having the dead space here, does anybody else have any questions or anything they want to bring up? Topic of any some sort? Anyone?
Yeah, actually, I do.
Bueller. Go ahead.
Well, go ahead.
So, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, sound good.
Okay, great. So I guess my initial question would be, what is I'm just now coming into understanding the I'm familiar with obviously attacking and dealing with false teachers and bad theology, but what's the difference between that and polemics, or are they one and the same? That's my first question, because I have a couple other questions backed up to that too.
From what I've understood, polemics is more of an internal thing between Christians, while having like apologetics is more like defending your own faith against somebody, against Christianity.
Okay.
Would anybody else agree with that, or do they have any other thoughts?
It's a defense of the faith.
Yeah.
Okay.
So polemics is more like arguing with one another.
Okay. Which is what I see a lot on like Pulpit and Pen or something like that. A lot of bantering bit back and forth between people who are believers, so to speak. So when you deal with somebody who is considered by many in Christian circles to be a good teacher, and yet he is clearly a false teacher. This person particularly, and does not teach, or he teaches rather, that and this is something that was interesting when I'm hearing Jason talk about his conversation with Leighton, because there's all these other things going into my mind too about this particular individual who believes that when a person gets saved, they are reverted back to their nature of Adam and Eve pre-fall, of Lucifer pre-fall, so that's an interesting conversation I've been having. How do I deal with that inside my own church, particularly because I'm not one to I'm new to I'm not new to biblical theology, but I am definitely new to being in a position where that is definitely required of me now. I was just elected an elder in my evangelical Presbyterian church, and so now I'm seeing more and more stuff that needs to be addressed. And there's a lot of people who just want to be united in a sense and get along, and not address bad teaching, like the fact that we don't have a sin nature anymore. Once you're saved, you are still able to sin, but you don't have the sin nature, which just makes absolutely no sense to me.
Well, first of all, congratulations. I think that's a very honorable position to have when it comes to being an elder of your church. About a lot of responsibility. And I would highly recommend that you do your homework, figure out what the role of an elder is first, and really begin to start digging more and more deep into theology, about systematic theology.
Absolutely.
Crack open a book or go to CARM, or get whatever resource you can and start learning about the attributes of God, about just knowing the difference between sanctification and justification.
Right.
All that stuff. You got to know all that stuff first.
Well, and I agree, and I wouldn't have taken on the position unless I had a decent understanding. My particular problem is that I feel like I'm one of the few who have this unction to protect the flock of God from bad teachers, like said individual who not only posits this about our lacking of a sin nature, which is clearly lacking any biblical insight in 1 John, but also the idea that that Satan has access to our thoughts. And this stuff is acceptable in what appears on the outside to be a perfectly reformed church. And I don't mean perfectly in that, but in that general, we're pretty overtly reformed, and you see classes by all these great reformed teachers all the time, and yet you see this influx of this charismatic theology into our church and I think it's because it's kind of like Simon the sorcerer, seeing the power of God move, and so he wants to have that for himself at whatever cost. And for us, the cost is biblical, and is biblical authority and sufficiency, which has been an issue. That's kind of where I'm coming from now, and I feel like I'm maybe the younger-ish. I'm definitely the youngest of the group of elders, but maybe they see me as, and I've not had very many conversations with them yet, but they see me as kind of that young, excited guy who just wants to take on the world. And that's actually, have no real interest in taking on the world, but I do have an interest in making sure that people in our congregation are dedicated to the Jesus the Bible presents, and not what anyone wants it to be. Because I don't care what anybody thinks; I care what the scriptures think. So I guess my big thing is feeling, I guess, one of the 12, and literally one of the 12 in our particular session right now. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
So I'm a deacon in my church, I'm in a Baptist church, so I'm basically an elder. And I'm the youngest, so I'm in a very similar position to you. And coming in, I've been a deacon. This will be my 3rd year.
That's awesome.
And so coming in, I definitely felt kind of how you felt, where it's like, okay, I don't want to be this young gun coming in telling them how to run things, right? And so I think, because I have that same drive that you do, that you I take my charge as a deacon very seriously, that I am to protect the flock, right? I feel very, very deeply about that, because I've seen flocks be hurt. I've personally, the last church I was at, the elders did not do a good job of protecting the flock, and that's one of the reasons why we left. And so I take that very seriously. My dad was an elder when I was a child, and that was his thing, was protect the flock. So I totally get where you're coming from. The one thing that I've found is that shock value generally doesn't work. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to figure out somehow to teach the actual biblical truth that this person is teaching falsely. And then once people understand that biblical truth, whether it's the elder board or the congregation or the pastor, or how, I'm not sure how it all works in you said EPC, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm not sure how the church structure works there. But teach the biblical truth, make sure that's being taught. And then once that's internalized, then you can kind of flip it on its head and say, okay, now you realize what this guy's talking about, right? This guy isn't teaching what we know is in this, and this verse.
Mm-hmm.
And then because usually these false teachers are very charismatic. They're very good at getting people emotionally bought into them. And so if you say something like Cindy Jacobs is a false teacher, and you have all these people that just love Cindy Jacobs because she's got a bubbly personality,
Mm-hmm.
what are you doing? Well, you've just pitted yourself against the bubbly personality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying anything about you. I'm saying this about myself. I'm the jerk.
Oh, sure, sure.
No,
Yeah.
but what I'm going to say is I'm the jerk at church, right? Like I'm the guy that'll shoot the wolves. I'm the guy that is going to, I love you, and I love hanging out with you, but if you're in sin, I'm going to tell you. And so I'm not the bubbly personality. I don't want people to like me because I emotionally. Vincent says I'm a jerk. I'm a jerk
Yes.
everywhere, right? That's true, Vincent. But like, I don't want you to like me because I've duped you into liking me, right? And so like, pit me against somebody that has a bubbly personality, like a Joel Osteen or whatever. I'm going to lose every time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason my church is a small church, and his is, has millions of people. It's the largest church in America. He's got a lot of charisma, and so you have to fight the false teaching with truth.
Yeah.
And once you have that truth internalized, they're going to break down that emotional attachment themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in essence, instead of saying such and so is a false teacher, this is a false teaching, and by the way, X, Y, and Z individuals are involved in this false teaching.
Correct.
Oh, sorry about that.
And yes, they're a false teacher, but when you have that, what I've found, and this just might be me being pragmatist or whatever, but what I've found is that instead of calling somebody a false teacher, which they are, I'm not denying that, but instead of like out and out calling them that, point out, okay, here, yeah, this, and this is not what we believe here. And then when somebody brings up, oh, well, I went to this conference, it's like, well, what did then you can get into that,
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, does anybody else have any thoughts on this, like a different approach? That for me, that has practically worked for the congregants in my church.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying, if you go in guns a-blazing there, you're going to offend and harden people away from you pretty quickly.
Right, and I've generally kept my mouth shut. I haven't really said much yet, and I heard this about 2 months before I was elected, and I've really wrestled with how to address it, because many in our church were very taken by the truths, of course, the half-truths that were presented, even myself to a degree, and only upon a reflection afterwards did I have to really take a step back and realize I had been massively duped, and so were lots of other great, people, in my congregation, and how to lovingly, rebuke to bring truth back to my fellow believers and my fellow congregants, and also to, warn against the wolves, as Peter talks about in 2 Peter. So I totally appreciate where you're coming from, and that actually does answer some questions about how to address it. I guess now it's just the avenue, where to start and how to proceed from there.
Yeah. And how many other elders are on the board?
There are 12 total. I am the one of the 3 brand new ones that just came on about 2 weeks ago.
Cool. That's very awesome.
I'm certainly excited, but I know how much work it's going to be. But,
totally.
Yeah,
totally.
But I'm excited all the same, and I certainly hope that God works through me, and that and it's going to test where I stand too in some ways. My devotion to Him, my prayer life, which it's definitely opened up holes in my, I mean, in more than normal. It's kind of like when you buy that car, all of a sudden you start to see that car. And so now I'm an elder and I have these certain responsibilities, and I fall way short in some areas. And so, so anyway, so I don't want to, I don't want to make people angry because I'm a jerk, just like you were mentioning, like
like I am.
No, certainly does not sound like it to me. That's for sure. The several times that I don't want this to be the Mutual Admiration Society, but it has been really cool to hear, Christians talk to one another like this and be honest, but be, caring of each other's souls, just like Spurgeon, it's been a cool experience to listen to this for several weeks.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate your time there and your question. That was really
great
good.
question.
Thanks, man.
Let's move on to the Nikki T. She had a question earlier that she posted on the side chat. Nikki, if you want to go ahead and chime in, or if you want to just go ahead and read your question, go right ahead, or read that.
Sure. So something that's been on my mind a lot recently has been the fear of man, and it was kind of pointed out to me. Like, I forget exactly what I was saying, but the pastor, I was saying something about how I worried about what other people thought of me, and my pastor said, "So you have a fear of man problem," and I just was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess I do," and now I've really realized it when I've thought of even conflicts at work. Like, I find myself being afraid to confront friends or coworkers because I'm just afraid of what they're going to think of me. And so what I wonder is, how do you personally combat that, or if you struggle with it, if you do, how do you combat it?
Real quick for clarification, you're not talking about fear of men. You're talking about fear of other people, right?
Just to clarify, I'm not afraid of men.
Okay. I just want to make sure. All right. So you're saying that you're
just worried about what other people think about you, and that you don't want to be saying something or put in a position that's embarrassing.
Right, like I'll be scared to share the gospel with somebody because I'm afraid that they're going to reject it and reject me, and so then I don't, and I allow that fear to control me.
Can I jump in a little bit?
Yeah, Matt, go right ahead.
Matt, go ahead.
You've been quiet.
Well, first of all, that's normal. I mean, I've been doing this for 37 years, and I still have the tinge of that every now and then. It's just normal. And so what you do is just say, well, Lord, okay, that's the way it is, and it's how it is, and help me move through it and give it a shot. And it's as simple as that. And you just try, and you need to try. It's like riding a bike, I'm afraid to get on the bike. Well, let's get on the bike, I'm afraid to learn how to ride. Well, let's get on the bike. It works. You got to go through it. So I don't think it's abnormal. I don't think it's anything to be ashamed of. I think it's just normal, and you got to learn how to trust God through it, and He'll be there with you.
One question I would have is, number one, are you attending a church, Nikki?
Yes.
And then, are you involved in some sort of mentoring at your church?
I'm kind of new there, I'm not actually a member yet, but I have been figuring that out. So
okay, because when Matt was saying, it's always nice to have somebody help you get on the bike and guide you along, and going out and doing that with somebody can be very helpful.
Right, and I don't have. See, honestly, I don't have that same fear when it comes to maybe sharing the gospel with a stranger, but my fear is more like with my family members or with people I know very well. That's where the fear kicks in, and
totally.
Yeah, I think Matt's completely right that it's something that's normal that we all go through. But one verse that I think about in that situation is Matthew 10:33, when Christ says that whoever denies me before men, I also will deny him before my Father who is in heaven. And I think, do I really want to fear what this man thinks of the message that I'm going to give him versus what God, versus being afraid of what God would do for not giving the message.
Sorry.
That's a good way of thinking about it. And also, I guess, who do you fear more, God or men?
Right. It always makes it's comforting, And also with giving the gospel, a lot of times people are afraid because they think they're not adequate enough. But we know that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. So it's the gospel itself. It's not our oratory means that is being used. We're simply sowing seeds and God gives the increase. So we put the faith and trust that he will give that increase, and not because that we speak elegantly.
Yeah, everything is under God's providence. But I would caution to not just go and share the gospel ad lib. For me, at least, it's always a tug, like a pull to do something. Maybe speak to a person, even if it's not actually sharing the gospel. But I found it interesting that that's the way God has been leading me. I've only been a Christian since 2009, so in the midst of that growing in Christ, lately I've noticed a pulling nature that I can't explain to do certain things. And then when I come away from that, I can't help but realize that wasn't a coincidence. That was definitely working in that. So maybe first try and seek out, yeah. Otherwise, you shouldn't be ashamed for preaching the gospel. Like who cares what they think of that conversation?
You get more bold when you do it more, and experience gives you a history that you can look back on. And one of the things that helps me is I just say they need the gospel. It's just as simple as that. And Lord, give me the words to speak. And I'm always worried preaching the gospel, because I know what a sinner I am. I know I may not say it the right way. I know that I may screw up that way. I know I may get arrogant that way, or this, because it's such an important thing. And I just say, Lord, just give me the words and open their hearts, and then just move forward and trust. And then it's not if you mess up, it's when, because the reality is, we don't have that confidence a lot of times because we just don't have the experience. And then if we do mess up, a lot of times I don't want to do that again because I didn't do it as well as so-and-so. Well, in all seriousness, I have a lot of answers for a lot of stuff. And that's true. When I go out witnessing with guys and girls, I like to not say anything. And the reason is because I won't preach the way I think they need to hear sometimes, because I'm too in the mind. And a lot of times people are just hearing the spirit, and they'll say what needs to be said. So, situations are different and people are different. And I think that basically one of the things you got to realize is you're going to mess up. You're never going to say, oh, I did that perfectly. But it's okay. It's that gospel. It's that power of the gospel, Romans 1:16. And just take a risk for Jesus, because that's what you're doing. You're trusting him. And I have a saying, it's real simple: trust and go. And
have any of you
Okay.
have any of you dealt with having your family reject you for the gospel's sake?
Yes. My eldest daughter.
That must be really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had family. Well, not my parents or like my sibling, but say my aunt. It's interesting. There can be that friction that you may not have even caused, that just spills over and ruins everything even more. And that's just by not me actually sharing the gospel, like going out of my way to share the gospel. It's actually her asking me questions that then, I don't know, she uses that to then cause a further distance within the family. I don't know if you guys have had the same thing.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of friends pretty much disown me. My family, as far as like my mom and dad and brother and sisters, they they understand my faith, but they don't really talk about it with me. They know that it's something that they don't want to get entangled with me, because I'm a little aggressive, I guess. I don't know.
You're too into it, right?
Huh?
You're too into it.
Yeah, they think I'm just some kind of weird Jesus freak kind of guy or something. So they don't really talk about it. Anyway, appreciate your question there. And Leighton Flowers just dropped off. Jeez.
Oh,
okay.
sorry.
No, it's okay.
Oh, no, you're fine.
No, it's not your fault. Just kind of was going to let Leighton Flowers have his discussion with us, but I would say that in your situation, though, the Gospels is far too important over your personal comfort. Where sometimes you just got to put it out there. I would also recommend taking a little time to have you ever heard of Wretched TV or Wretched Radio?
I have, yes.
With
I've
Todd Friel
before.
Yeah. Every Wednesday he has this thing called Witness Wednesdays.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm telling you, when I heard that over and over and over about the Witness Wednesdays and how he approaches other people and shares the gospel with these students at the at Georgia University, it's so encouraging to hear that, because when you start hearing it over and over and over, it just becomes easier and easier to kind of play it through your mind of how he approaches these kids and these other people. And it really does help. It's a teaching tool to understand how to witness to people, and that would also include your parents, I think, or your family. Yes. So anyway, Leighton Flowers popped right back again. Can you hear us, Leighton? Is your mic working?
Yeah, I hope so. My internet connectivity must not be real good, because I logged in and it dropped me for a second, and then I logged back on.
Yeah, I was kind of worried there, because you popped in and out. So,
well, I kept getting pings on Twitter and Facebook that y'all were talking bad about me. So I guess my ears were burning through social media.
Miracle of modern technology, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah,
I was enjoying my evening, minding my own business, and
the eyes and ears are everywhere for Leighton.
I guess so.
You're like Sauron, you're just the eye is everywhere.
I don't know if I like that comparison or not.
Yeah, I know. I'm not sure about that either. You know what? To be honest, what we were talking about was your discussion that you had earlier today with Jason Mullett from Logical Belief. And so he was just kind of filling us in as far as what his thoughts were concerning all that. And unfortunately, Jason Mullett isn't here anymore, so he can't really get a two-sided conversation with that. So, I mean, if you have any thoughts or any, how did you think it went? Let me just ask you that, I guess.
It's a very cordial conversation. Jason's very intelligent, and I think he did as good a job of any Calvinist that I've had discussions with representing Calvinism. he's a little higher form of Calvinist than, say a John MacArthur or even probably a Piper. And that's more of my, that's kind of the Calvinism I came out of, was a little lower form of Calvinism. And so, and I think he probably represents more where you guys stand, like A.W. Pink and that kind of a group versus, like I said, MacArthur or more mainstream, Southern Baptist Calvinist. And so there was some disconnect there probably on some things, just because, when you're talking to Calvinists, or you guys are talking to Arminians or traditionalists, there's different kinds. It's not a monolithic group on either side. So you kind of figure out the type of person you're talking to, or kind of where they fall within the camp. And so sometimes you talk past each other with terms and those kinds of things, and you gotta kind of weed through those terms to figure out which each side is meaning. But overall, I thought it was a good conversation.
And the topic was free will again, right? Or libertarian free will.
Yeah, and we went all over the place. You end up,
as usual.
you cite a passage, and then the other one wants to give a response for that passage, and so you kind of chase down, whatever trail it goes down, and that's just the nature of online discussions.
I don't think I'm just looking at who's still here. I don't think any of us have actually listened to it. I know it was posted earlier today.
Oh yeah, we just recorded it today. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think Aaron said that he tried.
Yeah,
he said your voice lulls him to sleep.
That's what all the parishioners say whenever I preach in church too. They always play my podcast to be able to go to sleep at night. It's really kind of insulting, but.
or I mean, you could take a positive spin, is that you just have a really nice voice.
Well, yeah, I think that's why I got pinged online. Y'all want me to get on here to help y'all go to sleep, don't you? Y'all want to ask me a question and then help me put y'all to sleep.
There you go.
Actually, Matt just said that he's thinking about taking off, but if there's any questions for him at the moment, Leighton, do you have anything for Matt, or does Matt have anything for Leighton, or do you guys want to have a quick bout when it comes to libertarian free will?
Well, if Matt's needing to go, I totally respect and understand that, but it would be interesting to know what Matt's view of libertarian free will is. I don't know. I know we've had discussions on the doctrine of free will, but if he wants to chime in on it, that's, he always has good insight.
Yeah, how about if we do it maybe next week? Because lately, the past few days, I've just been having a lot of trouble concentrating for very long, and I'm just tired. Like,
no, I understand.
I think I'm just doing too much, getting burned out, and I'm having trouble.
Yep.
So,
too many buttery croissants.
yeah, and
it's getting kind of late. It's kind of getting late anyway, so yeah, we can always talk later.
Yeah, it'd be fine, and I could do that. I'm gonna be writing some articles on Molinism and some issues and some stuff, and
cool.
And it'll be worth discussing some of those things, I think, and polishing up some of the stuff. But now I'm like looking at the clock, going, "Oh man, I just realized I'm tired." That's all. So
no worries. We can talk later.
Yeah. So anyway, talk to you guys later. I'm just gonna go.
We'll make it up next week or something like that. We'll make it an event.
All right, sounds good. See you guys.
Good to see you, Matt. Have a good one.
All right, you too. Okay, bye.
Awkward silence.
So
do now with Leighton Flowers in the room.
Well, I'm curious. How did Jason think the discussion went?
He thought it went well.
Oh, good. Well, I felt like it went well.
I mean, obviously, you guys have differing opinions,
Well, yes.
which is why you're discussing. So,
of course, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
But I think overall he would say it went well. So, yeah.
Well, were there any major issues that he brought up that he didn't feel like we fully vetted or fleshed out?
That I'm not sure. He he did say that from your definition of contra-causal free will, that you would have a problem affirming any type of original sin.
Yeah, it seems like we did kind of a line of the discussion was on that. And of course, I defined free will as, or contra-causal freedom as the categorical ability of the will to refrain or not refrain from a given moral action, which is actually not from me originally, but from several scholars that I cited. But yeah, I'm not sure how that interferes with our concept of the concept of being under the nature or the curse of sin, because I still believe that we have, the ability to refrain from, any given choice that you're faced with. You have the ability to refrain or not refrain from that given choice. And so just because people can't fulfill the demands of the law doesn't negate, in our estimation, it doesn't negate the libertarian freedom. It simply is acknowledging that mankind, even if, and this is the point I try to make in the discussion with him, even if someone technically could actually obey every single one of the laws, they still wouldn't attain righteousness, because righteousness can't be attained by the law. And that was the whole point I was trying to make. That's one of the reasons that we say infants, or if somebody was born in a vegetable state or something of that nature, we would still say they need the blood of Christ to cover them. And the only reason we would say that is because, obviously, even if someone doesn't break a law, doesn't mean that they're going to be saved based upon their own righteousness. It's not attainable through the works of the law. So that's the point I was trying to get across to him, is that the Scripture is teaching pretty clearly that we can't attain righteousness by the works of the law.
So I'm just thinking off the top of my head here about that.
I know. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember exactly what Jason said too.
Well, this is just something from me. It's not even from Jason. But would that mean that you don't deny that, or you would say that it's possible from your view of contra-causal freedom, that it's possible that someone could obey the law?
Yeah, they could obey any given command. That doesn't mean they can fulfill the demands of the law, because the demands of the law can only be fulfilled by a perfect.
Oh, there he went. He did. It happened to us.
Yeah,
couldn't handle the question.
No.
It wasn't that.
I'm trying to remember exactly how Jason put some things, and it's getting late.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
And I know that, I don't want to speak for Jason. That's the problem, because I know he wants to mull some things over and have another discussion with Dr. Flowers. So I'll see if he can come back.
Pops back in here.
I know.
So,
David, how you doing? And David's not talking.
David wasn't ready.
David doesn't want to talk.
Maybe. Aris, how's it going, buddy?
Pretty good. How you guys doing?
Good.
Doing well. I'm home.
There he is.
There he is.
Did everybody get lost, or was it just me?
I think it was just you. And we didn't talk about you when you were gone.
That's some fun. Of course, your spies would have told you.
I was just telling. I was telling Chris that part of the problem is that it's late, so I don't remember exactly all that Jason said. And the other thing is that he wants to have another conversation with you, and so I don't want to speak for him.
Oh yeah. We ended on a note saying how we had a lot we didn't discuss.
Yeah.
And of course, you know how it is. You get so many different rabbit trails you can go down, and there's so much left unsaid. And there's really nothing you can't discover it all.
It's almost like we have an inexhaustible God.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Inexplicable. And yet we sit around trying to explain him. But that's the way it works. But Yeah, with regard to the libertarian free will, I mean, the whole concept of the ability to refrain or not refrain from a given moral action, or the ability to make a choice. I mean, I really don't know if he would contend with that. We tried to kind of I assume he holds to the basic view of compatibilism, that our choices are explicitly tied to our natures, and our natures are always, I guess, producing this greatest given desire within the given circumstances, which to me sounds a lot like animal instinct. But nevertheless, I don't disagree with the fact that we make choices based upon our nature. I just think that our nature is free to choose which of the competing desires we'll act upon, and that's why I try to insist on getting a definition from him regarding the free will of a regenerate person. In other words, if someone has been born again, can they resist temptation? And he seemed to think and seemed to teach that the only way we could resist temptation is that God gives us the effectual grace to do so. And therefore, if we don't resist a temptation, it was because God, for whatever reason, chose not to give us the effectual grace to resist that temptation, which seems to fly in the face of 1 Corinthians 10:13, where he says that any temptation that befalls us, that we're able to stand against it. And so it does seem to me that his view, and I don't know where y'all stand on that, but do you believe that every time you're tempted, the only way you're going to resist it is if God chooses to give you the effectual grace to do so, and the times you do sin, it's because God decided for a reason not to give you the sufficient grace to resist it?
That's a touchy little subject there.
I'm trying to think how I would put it.
Well, I would put it, I don't know how I would put that. That's getting a little more technical than saying just that during sanctification, or the process, during our walk with Christ, our sanctification, that we're an imperfect work in Christ, and we maintain the ability to rebel. Now, to get more technical into that, I guess to get into more detail, you're asking, when we rebel, where does that rebellion come from, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think both of us would agree that the rebellion comes from us. That we're the ones that rebel. The issue
comes from our flesh.
Yeah, the issue is whether or not God gives us sufficient amount of grace to resist that temptation freely or not. And Calvinists have a problem, at least those who deny libertarian freedom have a problem, because if he does give us sufficient grace to resist every temptation and we don't, then what you're ultimately doing is conceding to the point that there is a libertarian freedom, that he gives us what we need in order to respond willingly to him, but we choose not to. Then that's ultimately conceding libertarian freedom, and Calvinists don't want to do that, because then they're conceding the fact that salvation could be done in a similar way. And so Calvinists kind of are in a tough spot, in my estimation, when it comes to the concept of a libertarian free choice of one who's been regenerated, or even Adam and Eve prior to the fall. That's why, Piper and Sproul and MacArthur and even Calvin all admit ignorance with regard to why Adam sinned in the first place, because he didn't have a fallen nature. And therefore, there's nothing to blame it on, so to speak, except for appealing to the mystery of his free will.
Well, I think the reason why they refrain from positing exactly why Adam fell is because we lack that information. I mean, there's not much on pre-fall anthropology.
Well, just as there's not much on the nature of a free choice. I mean,
but there's
that's
a
the whole
lot
point.
on post-fall anthropology, and we would say that a regenerate person is in a totally different category than a non-regenerate person. So there's when the nature's changed, is they're in a complete different place than someone prior to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we would agree that there is a difference, obviously, between the fallen nature of man and even the pre-fallen nature of Adam. But the point of contention is whether or not we've lost whatever that ability was for Adam to sin or not sin. Because even Sproul and other philosophers, even from the Calvinistic worldview, maintain that Adam did have the capacity to sin or not sin, which for me is libertarian free will. That's what it means. And Jason seemed to have the misconception that I thought libertarian freedom meant that every single choice was libertarianly free, or that we had complete freedom with regard to every choice. And of course, we don't maintain that. We just maintain that there are libertarianly free choices, and those are the ones for which we would be held morally accountable, obviously.
But where would that line be drawn?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Between when we do maintain that libertarian choice and when we don't. Like, because what I mean,
what would be a libertarian choice? And
let me clarify.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I mean by that is that, of course, you would agree that there are, or you would say that there are times in Scripture where God determines things, but that doesn't necessitate or even speak to the fact that He does that always. So that's kind of the same with the libertarian free will, or that there's times when we have libertarian choices and times when we don't. Well, where do we draw the line with either of those?
Okay, well, I will use the example that I used in the discussion we had with Jason in the debate, or the discussion we had. I suppose that both of us sinned yesterday at noon. We both lied yesterday at noon, let's say. If we hold to what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, no temptation has overtaken you, which is what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you're tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Do you believe that God provided a way out so that you could endure the temptation to lie yesterday, even though you did lie? Could you have resisted from lying?
Well, I think that, I know that's a good question for what we're talking about, but as far as a Christian goes, a regenerate person goes, then Christ is always available. So that way it's been provided. So,
correct. So if it's been provided and you still lie, that's libertarian freedom. It's in a sense, He's given you the sufficient grace to respond positively, but you still responded negatively. Therefore, that's libertarian freedom.
Well, how is that not in the same sense, or how could that not be classified or defined as compatibilistic, in that at the time that you lied, that was the greatest inclination you had?
Greatest desire.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the greatest desire you had, was to tell that lie at that moment.
And who determined your greatest desire, and who determined that you're going to act upon that particular greatest desire?
Well, I did.
Why?
Because I still maintain the ability to rebel, even after regeneration.
But you also maintain the ability to not rebel. So what caused you to choose to rebel versus not rebel? You're describing libertarian freedom.
The instances in my thoughts at the moment that made that lie the greatest desire that I had at that particular moment.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the temptation themselves, and the stimuli, the temptations outside of you, actually determined that your will would choose to lie. Therefore, you were tempted beyond what you could bear.
No.
Even though God says He would never allow you to be tempted beyond what you could bear.
Well, who's to say I couldn't bear that? I could bear that lie through Christ, but that's not trying to give or trying to say that that's okay to do, but that's true.
I'm actually more interested I might have misheard this, so I apologize if I'm misrepresenting you, Leighton. You said something about where sometimes our choices are not libertarian, and I'm not
what I'm saying is not everything that we do is necessarily categorized under libertarian freedom. In other words, there are some things that we do instinctively as creatures. There are some things that we do that are, possibly motivated by God's, sovereign will. For example, the inspiration of Scripture. With Paul or one of the other authors of Scripture, they're obviously writing under inspiration, so they're being they're being directed in a supernatural way by God and his desires and his will. There's other situations in which, Jonah, for example, he doesn't want to go to Nineveh, but God uses obviously very external persuasive means to ensure that he does go. Well, there's other things that, there may be things that we want to do libertarianly in the sense that we want to do something, but we're restrained from doing that thing based upon some physical impediment or something that comes in our way, which could be deemed as a circumstance that God actually used to keep us from doing something we libertarianly wanted to do. And so the point being is that we're not trying to say that libertarian freedom somehow overrides or overrules God's freedom. That's no libertarian that I know of, theist libertarian that I know of, holds to that perspective. God has the power and ability to override the heart of the king, for example, as the scriptures often quoted. But that's the whole point, is if libertarian freedom doesn't exist, what will is he overriding? His own? He's not overriding his will, he's overriding the will of the king, which proves that the king had to have a will that was autonomously separate from God. Otherwise, God's just overriding himself. And so it's just things like that sometimes I think Calvinists, or at least some Calvinists, depending on what form of libertarian / compatibilistic freedom they hold to, seems to kind of indicate that those passages which speak of God overriding or overruling the will of man somehow proves that the will of man isn't free. And that's again, I think, a little bit of begging the question.
Leighton, is my mic on?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't consider myself or would call myself a Calvinist, but I kind of see Paul having the same struggle when he complained about finding himself doing the things he didn't want to do and not doing things that he knew he should be doing. I think on this side of eternity, our problem is we have a bent in our nature. God is faithful indeed, like you mentioned, to provide those ways of escape in the midst of a temptation. He's always faithful in that. I think our bent prevents us from taking that off-ramp that would be the escape from the temptation due to our nature at this point in time. So I think that's compatible with our nature, just as it is compatible with God to faithfully provide that escape. So I see I'm not seeing how, I guess I'm looking forward to the salvation question. Contrary to our desires, sometimes our free will is affected by our nature, and sometimes we choose contrary to God's desires on this side of eternity, and that to me would define compatibilist free will, just as God is compatibilistic in the sense that he does not have free will to sin or to stop being God. That would be incompatible with his nature. I think it's the nature that rules, and the nature we occupy this side of eternity, unfortunately, has that bent.
Yeah, I don't know that I disagree with anything that you said. I'm not sure if you're trying to disagree with anything that I said either.
Well, no, I'm just saying that the libertarian free will, I think, perhaps is a very narrow and limited in its. Well, I mean, I think you're giving too much weight to it. That's all. Not that it doesn't exist, but I think what comes out on top in the final analysis is compatibilist free will.
Well, both of us can claim to be compatibilistic in the sense that both of us believe that God's sovereignty is compatible with man's responsibility. And so all of us theist Christians are compatibilists in that regard. It just so happens that Calvinistic compatibilists have kind of claimed that term for themselves, and they have defined both sovereignty and free will in a way that's distinct from what some throughout church history have defined it. and that's why there have obviously been two streams of, thought with regard to the free will and responsibility of man within the sovereign will of God. And so both of us believe that both God's sovereignty and man's freedom or free will, or whatever word people want to choose to use, is compatible. It's the question. The question is how you define both sovereignty and free will so as to make them compatible with each other. So neither one of us are trying to deny what we both agree is clearly taught in Scripture, and that is that God is sovereign and man is responsible.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right. Some flavors of Calvinism, I've seen them define themselves into a corner when it's not necessary to do so.
Well, and I've heard some Calvinists who concede libertarian freedom. They believe that Adam and Eve had libertarian freedom. They believe that we have a form of libertarian freedom once we're born again, but that prior to being born again or prior to be regenerated, we don't have the libertarian freedom to respond willingly to the the offer of the gospel, and thus God has to be the one who steps in to give us a new heart. And so that's a lower form of Calvinism, and a lot of Calvinists call them inconsistent, and maybe rightly so. I don't know, but some Calvinists do take that lower form by conceding there has to be some kind of sense of libertarian freedom within at least the pre-fallen Adam or post-regenerated Christians.
Well, see, I find it difficult for me to relate myself to the pre-fallen Adam because I'm a product of his fall, so to speak, or I suffer the consequences of his fall at this time, and that's what gives me that bent in the wrong direction, in my view. So I really have a hard time wrapping my mind around what I would be like as a pre-fallen man. And I think I'll continue to have a problem regarding myself or relating the question to a pre-fallen man, because that's something that is beyond my ability in the fallen state of things, as it were, the entire creation being suffering corruption at this point, as a result of the first Adam, but will be set right by the last Adam, Jesus Christ. So I expect to understand it in the future, but I think my perspective at this point is limited because of the consequence of Adam's behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but there's also the consequence of being regenerated. And so that's the question is, does regeneration truly enable you, as what we read from 1 Corinthians 10:13, resist temptation, or doesn't it? And so when you are tempted and you do actually fall into sin, do you explain that the way Jason does in our discussion by saying, well, God, for some reason, withheld his, a sufficient amount of grace for you to respond positively, which I think is very problematic for the Calvinist.
I'm not sure I see the problem when I'm told how it is, the mechanics of how it works when I am regenerated. Let me just post that in there from John, the first chapter. The mechanics are on the side of God, it seems. He does the nuts and bolts and putting together of how that works, since he's responsible for that regeneration, and I'm not. I have to give all the credit to him in that sense, in that narrow definition. And it seems to be that Romans 9 seems to support that. Let me just post that in there just so you can see what I'm talking about. It says it better than I can.
I'm familiar with Romans 9.
Yeah. So it doesn't depend on me. And the man there in the verse is singular, of course. So it applies to me just as much as it does to anyone else. So the libertarian free will, I think, is falling short of taking this into full account. And compatibilists would explain my need to have this done depending on God and not upon my libertarian free will in any sense or in any measure. Not to deny libertarian free will, but that in this sense, it has no part whatsoever. It's all on the other side.
With regard to John 1:13, I think you need to back up to verse 11, where it clearly talks about that he came to his own, and his own received him not. Who is that referring to?
Well, he says he came to the lost children of Israel.
Right. So Israel.
Yeah.
And so he said, but his own received him not, but those who did receive him, he's given the right to become a child of God. So clearly they have the responsibility to receive him. And we know that Israel during that time was rejecting the Messiah for the most part, whereas the Gentiles were in large part receiving him. And so to have the contrast.
Whoops.
What?
You got choppy on my end.
Did y'all lose me?
Just for a second.
Okay. So he's contrasting those who did not receive him with those who did receive him, and those who do receive him, they are given the right to become a child of God. And then the three things he lists there, I don't have it in front of me, but you got it on the side chat there. The three things he lists there are all things in which the Israelites depended upon and thought were the basis for their election and salvation. They were born not of blood, which would be the lineage of Abraham, the will of the flesh, which would be talking about the desire to work after the things of the law, because it took a lot of willpower to do the works of the work of the law. That's why it's called a yoke that they would put upon them, because you had to have all this willpower and striving after the law to be able to maintain your status. And then, of course, the husband's will, that the patriarchal head was the representative of the family, and so it was through that father's representative that ultimately one would be saved. And so he's denouncing the fact that we're not born again because of all of these things that the Israelite people had come to depend upon, but we're born again of God. And so I would just concede with you that all of us believe that God is the one who gives us new birth. But the question is, does he do that arbitrarily for just people for no apparent reason, or does he give new birth to those who receive him through faith? And we would say, obviously, it's the latter. Those who receive him, he gives the right to become children of God. And so he does give them new birth. It's God who gives new birth, but he gives new birth to those who receive him through faith.
Well, does he grant them?
Real quick, hold on real quick. I think you've just set up a false dichotomy, because I don't believe that God chooses anything arbitrarily.
Exactly.
Well, if you could pull up Webster's and define arbitrary for me, I think it will fit almost perfectly with the way Calvinists describe unconditional election, which is God's choice without any outside influence. That's what arbitrary means. Now, granted, the term arbitrary is sometimes used in a negative way, talking about dictators who make choices without any regard to their subjects. And therefore, it carries a negative connotation with it. And sometimes Calvinists don't like the term arbitrary because of the negative connotation that's carried with it. But in the strictest definition of the word arbitrary, making a decision without any outside influence, without any consideration for anyone except oneself, that's what arbitrary means.
The first definition at Webster's is existing or coming about seemingly at random or chance, or as a capricious and unreasonable act of will. And I would
keep reading. There's several options.
Well, I know, but that's the first definition, which is the most common use. And so I would take exception. I know that there's more. I know that there's more.
Well, you have a choice. You have a choice to pick which one you're using, though. I mean, that's what definitions are.
But the reason why people do disagree with the use of arbitrary is because the most common use is by chance, just by random, at random. That God just threw the dice, and it's just an arbitrary choice. There's no reason behind it. That's the common use of arbitrary, which is why you would get pushback.
At at dictionary.com, the number one is subject to individual will or judgment without restriction, contingent solely upon one's discretion. Number 2 is decided by a judge or arbiter rather than by a law or statute. And so I guess maybe it just depends on the dictionary we're using. The third point on this one, and this is again dictionary.com, having unlimited power, uncontrolled or unrestrained by law. And then 4, it gets to unsupported or unknown reasons, undetermined or not assigned a specific value. And so there are different choices here. Now this one, is obviously a little bit more positive than the one you picked from. And so I recognize that any definition of any term can have a negative connotation with it. I just don't know any other English word that describes the kind of choice that the Calvinist means when they're talking about God's choice that's completely and totally within himself and is not known to anyone else why he does what he does. It is a it is a choice that's made completely and totally of his own individual will and judgment without any restriction, contingent solely upon his own discretion, which is exactly verbatim what the first definition is here.
Yeah, we call it sovereignty.
Yeah, well, I understand that you can define sovereignty that way, but the Bible never does. So
the other issue that I have is you keep referring to high forms and low forms of Calvinism, and I'm not sure where you're getting your definitions of high and low, but you said that lower forms of Calvinism believe that Adam had pure libertarian free will, could act upon his own choice, and higher forms don't. But when I look at the confessions, which define what Calvinism, what the majority of Calvinistic believers in the world would believe, the confessions say, and I'm quoting from the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, the Westminster would also agree with this because they were London was based on Westminster. Can
I save you some time?
Sure.
About confessional Calvinism typically has more consistency. I'm talking about young restless reform guys who are claiming the name Calvinists, who are on online discussions and those kinds of things that don't hold to a consistent Calvinism. I even said that. Now there are superlapsarians, sublapsarians, infralapsarians, and thus even guys like, I know I've heard Phil Johnson on the Bible Thumping Wingnut show called James White a higher Calvinist than he is.
Hyper Calvinist. Yeah.
Well, no, he said a higher.
Oh,
Calvinist.
did he say higher? Okay.
Yeah, higher Calvinist. He wouldn't call.
Sorry, I was mixing up because Phil Johnson just had an article about hyper Calvinism. So
yeah, well, no, he does. He's careful not to call James White a hyper Calvinist.
Correct.
But what I'm saying is that there are different forms of Calvinism on some of those other issues. With regard to libertarian freedom, there has been historically some Calvinists who have taken a different approach. They may not use the term libertarian. In fact, there's even a Calvinist or two who holds to Molinism. And that, again, that's a different stripe of Calvinist, but just like every group, it's not monolithic, as y'all well know. Every scholar is going to have a different approach and way in which he handles certain things. I'm just telling you guys, in my experience, I have had conversations with Calvinists, some of which who affirm a form of libertarian freedom for post-fall Adam and a form of libertarian freedom for those who have been regenerated. And again, it may be a kind of libertarian freedom that they would define differently.
You meant pre-fall Adam. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. Pre-fall in the Adam, or, post-regenerated, Christian. And I still, even from our earlier discussion, have not heard a very good response to the issue of if we continue to sin and when we sin, if we had the freedom to do otherwise, with related to 1 Corinthians 10:13. I still think that's a pretty big issue for Calvinists to deal with while still trying to deny any kind of concept of libertarian free will.
No, I'd say we do and we don't.
And I would say
we had the choice. We had the choice to sin or not. that's true enough. But that choice was limited by our greatest desire at that time.
So, who determined your greatest desire?
It depends on what's happening, I guess, in that situation.
Paul was in that very struggle.
Y'all notice y'all are not answering the question, just so you know.
Well, Paul said, "Who shall deliver me from this madness?" And so he sees it as a big problem himself. He doesn't explain it away there.
So the answer to the question is, if his greatest desire is to lie at that moment. Yesterday at noon, my greatest desire was to lie at that moment. Who determined for my greatest desire to lie at that moment?
Who
Leighton?
determined?
Yeah, who determined for my greatest desire to be that I would lie yesterday at noon?
You're not suggesting that God would have determined or predetermined that you tell a lie.
No, according to Jason's answer, if I lied, it was because God did not give me the effectual grace to resist lying, and it's his purpose or plan or reason for doing so, and you can't question that. I'm saying I don't think that comports very well with 1 Corinthians 10:13, which says that God won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear, that we would be able to resist it. And so I'm asking you guys, do you agree with Jason's assessment that the reason that a person lies as a Christian would ultimately be because God decided not to give them the effectual grace to resist that lie?
I wouldn't put it that way at all. I have a larger focus or a larger picture of it, in that I also see that he's going to punish me, according to Hebrews, if I'm a child of his, for the wrongs that I do. So
I'm not sure how that's answering my question.
I'm seeing a bigger scale with a bigger balance here. I'm not looking at one side of the scale. I'm seeing that, yes, indeed, he could, grant me, and does often grant me the desire to overcome a temptation. But there's other times when I would give in to a temptation for which he will punish me and chastise me, being the faithful father he is. So the scale is got two sides to it. At this point in time in creation, I'm suffering the same struggle that Paul was suffering. Yeah, I think he was taking into view the bigger picture as well.
Okay, so you're appealing to mystery, it sounds like to me, as to what determined the greatest desire to be to lie at that moment in time. Because again, if God is the one who's ultimately determining whether or not he's going to give you the effectual grace to resist that temptation or withhold that effectual grace so that you will certainly sin in that moment, then you have to answer 1 Corinthians 10:13 and what was meant by 1 Corinthians 10:13, and that no temptation would overcome you, that you were not able to stand up against.
Not at all, because in that same verse in Hebrews, it says, as a result of my chastisement for having gone contrary to his will, his perfect will, good fruit will be born. And no punishment at the time seems pleasurable, but it will bear good fruit in the way he applies it. So even in his choice not to stop me, you might say, from sinning, his punishment will nevertheless accomplish a greater good on the other side of it.
So I think it sounds like to me you're agreeing with Jason in that God did not give you the sufficient grace to overcome, but he did that so as to bring discipline and further fruit in your life.
Discipline and a better fruit that would have never come to be had he not allowed me, or had he not restricted me from continuing in my own direction. He may have had a greater good in mind and allowed it for that purpose on the other side. See, I can't know that.
Sounds like a little bit like what J.D. Hall argues, where he says he gives some people, even Christians, a thorn in the flesh when we're talking about addictions. And we're talking about addiction to pornography, and there's Christians with addictions like this, or addictions to alcohol or other substances. that ultimately God gave them that thorn in the flesh because he did not give them the sufficient grace to overcome that addiction. And therefore, you ultimately end up trapping people into this victim mentality where they feel like, I can't get out of this addiction because ultimately it's God's decision whether or not he grants me this sufficient grace to overcome this or to resist it. And that can actually be a very dangerous doctrine and an impractical way of living, to think that ultimately I looked at pornography yesterday at noon because God ordained that I look at pornography yesterday at noon, and he restrained from giving me the grace needed for me to resist that temptation, versus being able to say to somebody, no, God does give you the grace necessary. You have everything that you need to stand up against the temptation that the evil one brings. And therefore, when you fail, it is your free choice to do so. It's your responsibility, and you've got to take ownership of that responsibility. Thus, to find healing, you've got to take ownership of that. You can't put it back off onto God for not stopping you. You've got to take ownership for Leighton didn't stop you. Leighton didn't say no. Leighton refused the grace that was offered and that was given, and therefore take responsibility.
We wouldn't even put that back on God. I mean, we would go to Romans 9 in the same situation where it says, why does he find fault for who can resist his will? It's
and his will. So his will was for us to look at pornography, but who could resist it? So it's okay.
No, I think that it's a very short-sighted view. I take the longer view. I would say, if I didn't take the longer view, I might get stuck in that error. But I would take the longer view, as from Genesis 18, where it says, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And of course, it's rhetorical. Of course he's going to do right. Now, if I didn't know that, I'd be lost in my short-sighted approach. Like I say, I've got to look at the whole scale and how it balances out overall in order to avoid that short-sighted, truncated position that's going to leave me faithless.
And Charlie, with all respect, I'm really not following what your comments, how your comments are answering the point of contention that we're discussing. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not following how you're answering.
I don't think you're being mean. No, I hope I didn't come across that way. No, I'm saying that if you're going to posit the idea that God would not, or would refrain from giving you what you need to overcome a sin, okay, I'm saying don't be so short-sighted as to leave it at that, but knowing that the judge of the entire earth will do what is right in view of the scriptures. Just Hebrews for.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like it sounds like what you're saying is, Jason Mullett is right. Is that God doesn't, when I sinned last time, that God didn't give me the sufficient grace or the effectual grace to resist that sin, but I should go on to say, but God is bigger than that, and God is a perfect judge, and he always does what's right, so we've just got to trust him. And therefore, if he wants to bring about a greater fruit, he wants to give me that thorn in the flesh to continue in addiction. If he wants to make me, when I'm tempted to cheat on my wife, and he wants to, not give me the sufficient grace to resist that temptation, break up my marriage, those kinds of things, that we've got to trust that God has a bigger plan in breaking up my marriage. He's got a bigger plan in allowing and even effectually decreeing for all those things to come to pass, and we've just got to trust him. Is that kind of what you're saying?
You're almost making it sound like you would suggest he's the author of those sinful acts.
No, I'm just saying that he's the one. He's effectually chosen, even for his own children. He's effectually chosen not to give the sufficient grace for that person to resist temptation, which is exactly what he says he does in 1 Corinthians 10:13. And again, that I've not heard one of you actually deal with that text and how you would interpret and exegesis that text.
That he gives you a way of escape?
Yeah, how would you exegete that text under the presumption that when you sinned last time, he did not give you the sufficient grace to resist that temptation? I don't think it's possible for you to exegete that text underneath that systematic way of thinking.
Well, sure it is. If I'm going to have in view that the judge of the universe will do what is right, if he withheld from me at that moment his grace to overcome the temptation, then I'm going to trust that it was right for him to do so. I don't have to understand it. He may want to actually chastise me as a result of my sinful act and bring about a greater and better fruit as a result. I don't know. Okay? I can't know. But I do know, and I can trust that he will do what is right in what he allows to happen, what he ordains to happen, what he prevents from happening.
Okay, so
I gotta believe it's all.
So let's exegete that text. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man. In other words, we all deal with the same common temptations, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you could endure it. So he seems to suggest that you can endure that temptation. So when you don't endure that temptation and you actually fall into it, did or did not God give you the sufficient grace to endure it, even though you didn't?
I'm looking for the verse here, so I can.
Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians 10:13.
1 Corinthians. Oops. You know what? It would cramp up. 1 Corinthians 10. Let me try that again.
And this also goes right along with the fact that all Calvinistic scholars that I'm aware of, well, not all, I shouldn't say that, Vincent Chung, and there are several others that are, I would say, higher Calvinist, I guess. You might not like that, but there's some higher forms of Calvinism that do attempt to answer the question as to why Adam sinned, even though he didn't have a fallen nature, and why Satan rebelled when his nature wasn't fallen. And they appeal to mystery. Well, appealing to mystery there is ultimately saying we don't know how and claim about the freedom of the will is that we believe that the cause of a choice is the chooser, and we don't understand it, how that works above and beyond that. We just don't go so far as to say it's because God has determined it. We just simply say it is the function of the free agent's will. And that is what libertarian free will is all about. Just as God could choose to create or not create, he could choose to save or not save. That's libertarian freedom. It's contained within the agent making the choice. And therefore we leave it at that. We appeal to mystery prior to contending that God is ultimately the one who has determined or brought to pass an evil desire or choice of man. And so the defense of free will.
Whoops. I think I lost sound.
No, we lost Leighton.
You still hear me?
Yeah. The only thing I would flee from myself is your earlier suggestion that God's choice on his side of the line is arbitrary. That seems to indicate that there's some unjust element in being simply arbitrary in his choices and ignoring the fact that the judge of the whole earth will do what is right. I can't ignore that. So I can't suggest, and I would flee from any idea that he was being arbitrary in his choice. It's just simply arbitrary and have no reason.
Well, it's no apparent reason. In other words, we know there's reasons that are possibly hidden from us within his own character.
Exactly.
Right? And that's why even the term arbitrary does not negate that.
Right. I'm just saying that
the term arbitrary is just saying that there's no outside influence.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's a dangerous tightrope for me to walk to try to suggest that it could be arbitrary when I know all along that he's going to do what is just and what is right. I got to fall on the side of the fence that says
appealing to the fact that God will always do is just and right doesn't negate what he actually reveals he will do in Scripture. And according to Scripture, he reveals that he will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can endure. And therefore, if we don't endure, then I would have to assume that we were free to endure. There's no reason to suggest that we weren't free to endure when simply based upon your, the compatibilistic Calvinists' presumptions about whatever logical inconsistency they think that libertarianism.
All it really suggests is that in this world, on this side of eternity, it's our cowardly yielding to temptation and distrustfulness of God. That's all on us. I mean, I'm looking at the verse here and looking at it in every way, shape, and form I can.
Well, here's the other issue, and feel free others to jump in here. I don't mean to monopolize anything, but let's take the fall of Adam. Would most agree that he had the ability? His nature wasn't fallen, so you can't say that it was his fallen nature that caused him to sin. Would we also just simply appeal to the mystery of the fact that a non-fallen man chose to sin? Could it be that his nature was free and that we still have that free nature, the ability to determine and make these choices for ourselves? Absolutely.
Can I add something in regards to that? And this is to Charlie. The Hebrew word for formed, the verb yetzer, 2:7. It's used one more time for the animals in verse 19. The spelling of it in verse 7 is unusual. It has an extra yod. It should be spelled with just one yod, but in Genesis 2:7 it has two yods, and scholars have thought that maybe the Masoretic text got it wrong. Maybe a scribe, misspelled it. It's like spelling Leighton with two L's. So it's unnecessary. But the Dead Sea Scrolls affirms the spelling as well. So the ancient conjecture was that Adam already had eight, just because of the grammatical argument of those two yods, that he had an evil and good inclination even before the fall, to emphasize his free will. So how would you respond to that?
To tell you the truth, I didn't really follow you.
What Han is saying is that grammatically, the Hebrew would support that Adam had libertarian free will, essentially, at the before the fall, and I think any confessional Calvinist would agree with that, because the confessions bear that out.
Well, no. Wait, you wouldn't agree with that, Brian?
No, I would.
Pearl says, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Y'all lose me?
No.
Yeah.
Well, maybe a little. I don't know. I don't know if you were trying to talk before I heard you in my ear. But
let me.
Chapter 9.
Maybe
of the London Baptist Confession of Faith says that the man in his state of innocency had freedom and power to will and to do that which was good and well pleasing to God.
Well, here's part of my presentation where I make that argument. So here you can see the two yods in the Dead Sea Scroll manuscript. So why would this be there? And why would every getting feedback? Yeah. So why would
I had to mute
there be?
Sorry.
Why would there be these confirmations even before the church that you already had this quote unquote, two impulses before the fall, which obviously refutes any form of original sin, because they had no concept of original sin, like the federal headship of Adam, that sort of thing. I don't know if my mic was cutting out, but
no, yeah.
As usual,
we can hear you, Han.
Information that General Han gives us, we end up just standing in silence, and we have no comment.
Okay.
Well, I think they had some indication as to consequences would follow, negative consequences, in the promise that in the day that you eat thereof, the double muth is presented in the Hebrew, which the closest we can get into that with the English would be, well, they say you should surely die, but the Hebrew indicates dying, you will begin to die. A process that they hadn't known or experienced up until that point was outlined for them as a consequence, and so they knew something of it, even though they hadn't experienced until the fall.
But it's qualified. It's Tahmuth. So it's spiritual death. There is no physical connotation.
Oh no, it's
mortality.
It's clearly presented, dying, you will begin to die. A process of death and decay would be initiated at the time that they were to eat of that tree. I mean, you go look to Kyle and Dalich, and they'll easily outline that for you. Any.
Yeah. So, but again, it's qualified. So it's Tahmuth. It's speaking about spiritual deaths, and Jews living, in the Qumran community and beforehand, would make the point that the so-called deaths is idolatry. It's very clear that because and in fact, even Paul in Romans 1, scholars make the connection between Romans 1 and the garden scenario.
So you would tend to say that the invocation of the double muth is only referring to spiritual death and not including physical death?
Yeah, because the same concept, and dissertations have actually been written on this, the same concept is applied to Israel. And Adam, so Israel typifies Adam in the sense that Adam is a high priest before the humans, plural. So there's a population of humans in that location.
Well, I've
just
seen
like Israel is in the midst
of a lot of analysis of that verse, and from some good sources, and I've never come down and seen one on that side of the equation that it didn't include both in the promise that dying you will begin to die.
Maybe I should give you some Talmudic exegesis to show you that it's well in line with ancient Near Eastern concepts of what happened. Adam was basically a high priest in the divine council garden of God. That's it can't be any simpler than that. And so Israel then typifies the exact same scenario, that when Israel is chosen to represent Yahweh before the nations, just like Adam is chosen to represent Yahweh before the humans, Adam fails, Tahmuth, he spiritually dies, and therefore he's exiled. Same thing with Israel. Israel sins, falls into idolatry. Israel is sent into exile. But there's this constant theme of redeeming that person, and hence Genesis 3:15, and also through Israel, the Davidic Messiah. And yeah, you see this in 1 Corinthians 15, the last Adam. Jesus is not the last man, but he's a typifying nature of the full circle.
Well,
to come back to
federal headship, right? We suffer under the federal headship of the error or the fall of Adam, just as we're going to benefit of the federal headship of Christ if we're in Christ. Yes.
Federal headship is not what Paul's thinking. All Jesus is doing is that the cosmic redemption starts by Jesus becoming human. and entering into the cosmos and joining the cosmos to his divine nature. There's nothing, I mean, if you're going to involve federal headship, then Roman Catholics have a point that Jesus would inherit Adam's guilt. And that's a big no-no.
No. We inherit from his fall, the consequences of that. And then we also benefit of the positive consequences of the sacrifice of Christ on our behalf. In that sense of federal headship is what I think is being spoken of by most of the Calvinists I've ever talked to. I don't see how quoting that very verse and then defining somehow otherwise, other than the Calvinists that I've met would define that. I don't think that's legitimate. I think it's a clear indication of how the federal headship works in the negative on us through Adam and on the positive on us in Christ through Jesus.
Yeah, but you won't find federal headship talk or ideas from the 1st century AD backwards.
The link is made right there by Paul, the very verse you quoted.
It's all typology. He did not say Adam is the federal head.
You use external sources to interpret the Bible, that you can't see past that.
But it's legitimate. Like, I mean, are you telling me that Paul never read those external sources? It's like as if Paul was just what he thought, what should be the case.
Are you denying the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, I mean, you have
Or are you just saying that Paul wrote it as a man?
Exactly.
I'm saying the Holy Spirit allowed a variety of perspectives that were obviously culturally based and understood to be included in the Bible, and that's very evident. There's many things that Paul says that you require cultural understanding to get it.
Yeah, well, I see Paul as having given up a lot of what he learned at the feet of Gamaliel in his conversion to Christianity. So what he may have understood and believed through a Talmudic teaching, a lot of it he gave up. That's why I wouldn't put any.
Like what? What did he give up? Because if, for example, two powers in heaven idea,
everything,
a form of binitarianism, that is probably the most key idea that was around Second Temple Judaism that then gave way to Trinity. You can't give that up if you're under Gamaliel.
Anyway, I think John wants to end the live hangout.
Yep. I want to go ahead and end it up. It's been a long night, and anyway, I really appreciate everybody who came in. Dr. Leighton Flowers, thank you, sir. Matt Slick, along with the rest of the council, Google Plus, appreciate it. And we will go ahead and wrap it up. This is John Wilkinson speaking for the Council of Google Plus. The council is no longer in session right now. We will be off air to continue discussion, but I know that many of you guys are probably getting tired. So again, thank you very much. We are part of the Bible Thumping Wingnut Network. Feel free to join into the conversation on their website, and also you'll be able to hear all the other podcasts that they offer. And they are also a value for value model. So if you found any value in this, please give some value back. Thank you very much. Good night. God bless. And see you later. Oops. Continue. I need to go and do that.